by Adam Klasfeld, the founder of All Rise News. Adam, we have some major breaking news here in the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals. Can you explain what just happened?
The Federal Circuit Court of Appeals, by a decisive 7-4 majority, agreed with the Court of International Trade that Trump's tariffs are illegal. These are the tariffs that he has labeled reciprocal tariffs and justified under the International Economic Emergency Powers Act of 1977. And we spoke about an earlier ruling in this case, and I predicted at the time that this court would would affirm the lower court's ruling that the tariffs were illegal. They did so by a decisive majority today because that law that I just mentioned does not have the word tariff. So I'm going to repeat this again. The law that Trump used to justify his power to unilaterally impose tariffs doesn't say the word tariffs. It gives the president of the United States certain powers under certain emergency declarations to do certain things to the economy. No president before Donald Trump had ever tried to justify imposing tariffs unilaterally
Yeah.
based on this law. That had always been Congress's purview.
So is there a way that they can go back to the court now and say, okay, well, he's not doing it based on this law, he's doing it based on another law?
What I think is going to happen is, the battle lines have already been set for this. The Federal Circuit imposed a stay of their decision through mid-October, I believe October 14th, for the government to appeal to the Supreme Court. This will go to the Supreme Court. They will hear this ruling. I don't think that they're going to try to come up with another justification. They have argued, and it persuaded 4 of the 11 judges, that there is language in the statute related to the regulation of imports that they believe they can hang their hat on. It didn't work at the Court of International Trade. It didn't work for most of the Federal Circuit panel. And I think that most of Wall Street is predicting it won't even work with this Supreme Court. This is too unprecedented a use of tariffs to find justification in a law that was never used for that purpose. Congress did not use these words. And as a matter of fact, in a concurring opinion, it's a long array of opinions in this 11-judge panel, but a concurring opinion ends by quoting James Madison. It says, Congress alone has access to the pockets of the people. And that's what's at issue here. Which branch of government has the power of the purse we've always heard about in our basic civics class?
Yeah.
And you have 2 courts decisively saying, no, the president cannot unilaterally impose import taxes, which is what tariffs are, based on this law that has not been used this way since its passage.
Well, this raises the question, if those tariffs were applied unconstitutionally because Trump didn't have the authority to do so, and everybody paid more money for all of these imports, if builders paid more for their construction imports, if food importers paid more and then passed those costs on to the grocers, who pass those costs on to the final consumers. Is there any recourse, or is that just? There's no way to even figure out all of the millions and millions and billions of dollars that have been overcharged on American consumers by virtue of these tariffs. But is there any recourse now for all of the tariffs that were unconstitutionally, illegally imposed?
As a matter of fact, Brian, now that's a very good question because remember, this same court had paused the ruling declaring the tariffs illegal. And one of the reasons the Trump administration was able to persuade the court to pause it temporarily while this appeal was pending was by saying, if this goes against us, we will have to reimburse the money. So there's no harm. Now, for when you get a stay on an order, you have to prove that what's the balance of the equities? Who is going to be harmed by pausing the ruling. So the government had argued, the Trump administration had argued that there would be no harm in letting Trump's tariffs letting them stay in place while the litigation proceeds because these refunds will be on the way. Well, that's the recourse. And now the Trump administration is using that same argument. Hey, if now we have to pay back all of this money, and that would be disastrous. They're using that promise to repay these illegally imposed tariffs, according to these two courts, as something that will be a terrible side effect if they lose in the final level, which is the Supreme Court.
Now, that's what I wanted to talk about next, their recourse here in the Supreme Court. Is there anything to read from the tea leaves that might suggest how the Supreme Court might rule? How impactful is the fact that already you have the Court of International Trade and the Federal Court, Circuit Court of Appeals, who've both ruled one way against Donald Trump? How much of an impact will that be on the Supreme Court?
Well, I think the fact that the Court of International Trade, which is not, it's a court that handles just this kind of issue, that technical, economic, international trade issues, not something that folks look on as a highly political court by any stretch of the imagination. The fact that their three-judge panel ruled unanimously, the fact that a 7-4 split, a very decisive split in favor of striking down these tariffs from the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals, shows some tea leaves saying that this is such an unprecedented use of tariffs power, the unprecedented interpretation of this 1977 law that was put in place to restrict the government's ability, and in particular the president's ability, to justify radical measures based on an economic emergency, that would somehow justify those powers. I think this is why Wall Street, and you see these predictions happening already, is betting that even this Supreme Court will find Trump's tariffs and his justification for tariffs a tough sell. The question is, how much will small businesses be harmed? This was a lawsuit brought by small businesses, later joined by attorneys general, but small businesses brought this. This is VOS Selections is one of the plaintiffs, and what will happen in the interim? How many businesses will be burdened or maybe go out of business before the Supreme Court rules?
Well, it's worth asking here, all of those companies that had to pay all of these import fees, all of these higher costs as the result of these tariffs, do they have standing to sue the federal government? I mean, we've heard so many times from administration officials, look how much money we've brought into the Treasury by virtue of these tariffs. Now, we know that these tariffs are a tax on Americans, but they have that money. And so if we find out that these tariffs are indeed, as the result of some impending Supreme Court ruling, if they decide to take up this case, if we find that they're illegal, even as far as the Supreme Court is concerned, is that amount of money that was already paid to the government because of these import fees on these tariffs, is that kind of a pot from which all of the impacted parties can then seek compensation, seek to make themselves whole?
Right. Well, as I said earlier, the government promised refunds. They promised reimbursements if the Supreme Court found this illegal. So those are the stakes that are set up. You have the White House boasting about the revenue that's brought in by people who are paying these import taxes, these tariffs. And now the question is, will the government have to pay up after Trump has unilaterally decided to impose tariffs, being the first president in U.S. history to do so?
So in terms of who can actually impose these tariffs, you cited the fact that James Madison cited that it was Congress who had the sole unilateral authority for power of the purse. how are you looking at how this Congress then might react? Recognize, I mean, this is more of a political question than a legal one, but if you'd be willing to venture in, knowing what you know about the obsequiousness, the extent to which they will be supplicants for Donald Trump, how Mike Johnson and John Thune and Congress might react if we then find out that Trump doesn't have this authority, that it rests solely with Congress.
Well, I think it's very telling that Trump has not pursued the way tariffs have been traditionally imposed through Congress, because there are a lot of people in his own party who do not believe that it is a great idea to unilaterally impose tariffs on unpopulated islands that have only penguins. That this
Right.
would be a tough sell among their constituents, and it would also be a tough sell that products that they sell that come from all over the world, that the burdens on small businesses in their districts. I think that Trump is really showing his hand a little bit in not bringing it
Right.
to Congress, where he wouldn't have, if this was passed through Congress, Congress does have the power of the purse. This lawsuit would evaporate
Right.
in terms of, if that was how he brought it through. But that's not what he did. And I think what a lot of the Republicans in Congress are betting on is that there's a political cost
Right.
to supporting tariffs, but there's also a political cost to opposing Trump.
Right.
So silence is the easiest, and acquiescence is the easiest way out.
Well, look, I think that's such a great point because, we had just discussed the fact that if Congress does want to kind of take the authority from Donald Trump, they would be fine. The lawsuit would evaporate. They have the authority to do so. But it is interesting that Trump went this route without Congress, which suggests that if Congress could have done it without any legal hurdles, they would have. And granted, Trump doesn't have any respect for the law or the separation of powers or our system of government anyway. So maybe that's why he just has this idea that the executive is all powerful. So that may be one thing. But the reality is that they knew. There's people in the executive branch smart enough to recognize that this was a legally tenuous position from the start, and that if they could just get Congress to do it, that would fix all of their problems. But the fact that he didn't go that route, you're right, might suggest that there is some pushback to having Congress be responsible for doing this, because at the end of the day, all this is a tax on Americans. It's a consumption tax on Americans. And so when you have your representatives voting in favor of these tariffs, like, for example, the tariffs that we've imposed on Europe, which is our biggest trading partner, everything gets more expensive. And so there is no political upside for these legislators, members of Congress and these senators to do what Trump is doing right now, which largely makes sense in terms of why Trump decided to do this unilaterally. Look, I do want to point out one more thing. And that is that for anybody who is looking to support excellent independent journalism, Adam's outlet, All Rise News, is the pinnacle of that. Anytime there is a case anywhere around the country, Adam is always on the ground doing it, but he doesn't have a network backing him up. He's doing this out of his own pocket through his own funding. So one small step that we can all take is to support him. Adam, I'm going to put the link to All Rise News right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. Again, highly recommend for anybody looking to support excellent independent journalism. All Rise News is exactly that. Adam Klasfeld, I appreciate your time as always.
Thank you so much, Brian. Always a pleasure.